We just finished our fourth poetry retreat, one that we hosted and facilitated, and we want to talk to you about things that all of our fellows were able to take away that maybe you can apply to your own poetry and to guide you in this process. Hello, guys. There's me. My name is Jeff.
Um,
Timer that frozen.
we froze.
We froze. And
Oh,
we
we're
back.
back.
Okay, you may have
We
caught
were
the audio.
we were actively doing that. That wasn't
We
just
just
screens. We just sometimes intermittent. We just like keep spice it up.
Anyways, just talk about some of our insights and things that we noticed that our fellows were able to take away that I wanted to share with you that I think will be important and things like that. This also complements the stream that we had. I don't remember, man, the connection might be spotty today, sorry. We had a stream a couple months ago just talking about poetry retreats and organizing them. Matthias, you mentioned you've attended a poetry retreat before. If you had to kind of just think back to that again and just being in that space, what do you think is the biggest draw to being in a poetry retreat?
So I've attended two. So I think probably of out of everything, because one of them I was kind of going back and forth from because it was like in the city, right? So I was able to go back and forth. Second was actually it was like in the UK, right? So we were all everybody that was in the retreat was kind of we were housed in this large estate, and so we were there for like 4 days, right? But the one that was here in the city, it was really cool. The biggest takeaways that I really kind of got, and the really biggest benefits, were that I was working in a community of writers that were, and we're it was actually we're putting together a collection, right? So we were doing something as a unit that was towards something larger. I would say it made me a better writer in the way that I think being in a space around community and just kind of reflecting on art, reflecting on these like really storied black artists makes you a better writer. I don't think that this space in itself was in an attempt to make you a better writer, if that makes sense. It was, which is
Mm-hmm.
not like, I don't think that was necessarily the goal. Like, the goal was to take these
Mm-hmm.
artists that are already really great artists, but then
Mm-hmm.
also instill like a sense of like this space of community in that space, which I think we
Mm-hmm.
all could took away, which is really beautiful. The other one that was in the UK, I think that had a much more like kind of lasered focus on kind of looking at your work and being able to come out of that space with work that you were really proud of. And so I think that was kind of a much more along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with that, my takeaways were, that a second, third, fourth, fifth pair of eyes on your work, it can only will strengthen your work. Whether it forces you deeper into your pocket where you're like, no, this is what I was really standing on.
Mm-hmm.
But more likely, what'll happen is you'll kind of realize, there's a lot of parts of your writing that you didn't really realize you were or weren't saying in the writing, that you're leaving up to hopeful subtext that maybe wasn't really there. And then it'll be stronger as a writer. So yeah, kind of both spaces kind of had their own advantages. So, so I think that one was much more geared towards making you a better writer as far as like
Mm-hmm.
the technique of writing.
Did you have a preference in terms of like a community-based retreat versus one that's more focused on the work?
Ooh. It kind of depends. I don't know that I would necessarily say I have a preference. I think both are needed, you know.
No.
So and it's also hard to say because it was like, the one that we had here, it was beautiful and I really, really enjoyed it, but it's really hard to kind of match with, kind of being in a different
Country.
continent. You're like
Yeah.
on a different continent. You're
Yeah.
on like your everything is kind of paid for. You're beautiful weather. Like there's a lot of really great things about. Shout out to Griot's Well Writers and Scribes. Just like a really really beautiful retreat. But yeah, it was like there. It's really which is to say I think it's kind of an unfair comparison that I became a better artist through both mediums. One was a better artist just in kind of being able to talk to and really work with my fellow artists in that space, in one space. And these are people that I see every day. These are people like, one of the people that was there was like somebody that was like little, like I was at my wedding. So like these are people that I'm close with to this day that I love and I care for. And if they do anything artistically, like I'm there to support. And then in the other one, it's just like, I think that I was, other than my wife, I didn't know anybody else there. So, and I also think that the temperament of a lot of the writing community, at least that I was a part, that we were a part of for that abbreviated amount of time there in the UK, it's just so different than what it is in the US. And in which is like I think they're just as they're just as hungry to write, but I think that they understand that it has to come with a kind of a flow of an experience and not something that's necessarily like you're forcing it. And so they're like, the nature walk because nature's outside. Let's enjoy nature, and then later on, let's think about maybe writing. And then I was like, that's actually that's beautiful. And I think that like I was really I'm there, so I'm really locked into, man. We got to work, and everybody else there was like, it's a writing retreat. So yes, we're writing, but don't forget the last part of that.
More
Like
importantly.
kind of take it in, kind of that way you can have some experiences where we make intentional time to write, and we all were kind of engaging in writing, but. Yeah, I don't know if I would say necessarily there's a preference. I would say that both of them, depending on what you need, both of those angles could be really good for you.
Got you. Yeah. I think something that we were trying to do with our retreat
Yeah,
was a mix. I mean, I think we were definitely, if I had to pick one or the other, I'd probably say craft related, but I think we had enough opportunities where we could do the community as well. So, for those not familiar, we just finished our poetry retreat over the weekend, so literally a couple days ago. It was a 3-day retreat, so it's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday commitment from our fellows, and kind of taking some models from different retreats. So, for instance, using a bit of the Kalu model in the sense that in the morning, it's reading analysis and craft analysis. We spent a lot of the writers mentioned that they wanted to work on form or they felt unfamiliar with form or like more traditional types of things. So we spent a lot of time talking about sonnets. We did some time talking about meter. We did some time talking about villanelles. We did some time talking about different sorts of rhyme schemes, turns, stakes, all those sorts of things that are very kind of craft heavy and finding it in work and then applying it to our own work. And then having a workshop session in the afternoon. So it's very similar to how Kalu works. One thing I will say is that I think a lot of the models that you see are very individual, or like it's very very like you have your teacher or your facilitator, and the facilitator tells you what to do, and then everyone does it, and everyone's kind of like independent, and then like there's like a group sharing, and then like it goes back to the facilitator, and then it's like group sharing, and then it's like back to facilitator, and then you work in division. So it's like that's this connection. I'm gonna try one thing. I don't know if it will work or not. We're gonna be right back. I'm gonna try to see if I can stabilize the connection at all with a refresh.
I'm just gonna climb to the top of the tower and then
Shake it a little bit.
shake it a little
Hit it
bit.
with a hammer. Watch this video. We'll be back in like 2 minutes. Give me 2 minutes and we'll be right back.
Facts are important, but like emotional truth that
Yeah.
poets get at is the most exciting and like maybe the most truthful.
When I read it in this space, when I bring it to this audience, why do I want to do that today, here, now? Something I think I'm doing a lot in my work is giving a certain amount to be able to see where this boat is going and where the waters are taking it, but not trying to paint the full landscape. Not only because, or not because I don't want to share it, but because I don't know if even I want to go there yet myself. So I'm wondering if how you handle that, and if it's scary at any points for you, or how you deal with that scariness.
Yeah. Well, first, so do you feel that way about Cruel Cruel?
God, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
a very common reflection I get from my work is, people are like, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I feel a lot of things. And that's kind of a lot of just my passion in art. Like, I don't always want to know exactly what's going on, but when I apply it personally, then I'm willing to approach what I'm willing to approach in the manner of which, or the manner and depth in which I'm willing to go into it,
Yeah.
And maybe, and we talked about this too, it's a long game of poetry, right? Things I'm tapping into now with Cruel Cruel, I surely will keep writing about, and surely I hope that, not that I'll reveal more, but that I'll discover more.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I asked because I feel like I recognize that in the book, but there was an intentionality behind it. I'm thinking of a specific moment that I marked. This stood out to me when I was reading. You said, I offer a puzzle that will madden you, but your ego feeds differently. I liked that itself as an offering of the text as a puzzle and as an offering, because I think even if there is distance that you're feeling and some fears about sort of, is this text going far enough? I don't know. I think there's something useful in that navigation, and then you being honest about that navigation on the page. Right? I think poetry is exciting because it's poets thinking about how do we approximate different truths on the page. And I think poetry can do that in a way that no other genre can. The reason I stray away from nonfiction when I do stray away from it is because facts are important, but like emotional truth that poets get at is the most exciting and like maybe the most truthful. But yeah, so for my manuscript for my book, it's called Bad Forecast. And it's about, it like circles around a tornado that was in my hometown in 2011. It was a very deadly, historic storm that the story and the narrative was picked up by the national news that entire summer. I was home that summer. My family's house was fine, but my aunt lost her home. Friends lost their homes, and one of my really close friends was killed. And I think I started writing that manuscript just because it felt sort of inescapable to write. I don't feel like I was particularly brave in approaching it. I think I think the sort of fractured, disheveled, tornadic feelings, if you will, that I was feeling about sort of the weather and the world that could contain something so kind of grim. All of that thinking was just showing up on the page in this like lyric or fractured way. And it's a book a lot about adolescence too, and coming out and race relations in Missouri. So there's like an emotional valence to it that is a bit younger, and that like let me express my fears as they are, and it helps me sort of be unafraid to do that because I could.
Well, they're on YouTube.
I'll be back.
Oh,
I guess that was right at the... All right, sorry about that. Hopefully this smooths out the connection a little bit. Just checking one last thing. All right, we should be straight. Anyway, so we were talking about just kind of the typical model that you often find. This isn't just in poetry. This is kind of just education in general. Like, I feel like the education model is just so... Like, we're doing things that... We're doing things the way we've done them for, like, hundreds of years. And it's like, well, guys, there's other models. It's like, maybe I'm very biased just because working with, like, ESL. And, like, a lot of ESL teaching is just... it's not really that special. It's just kind of like good teaching practice. It's like scaffolding, like prepare students for what's about to happen. Find ways to get them comfortable before they provide an answer. Like give comprehension checks. It's just like just basic
Yeah.
stuff like that. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the poetry model still falls into kind of that traditional like it's either whole group or it's individual, and there's not a whole lot in between. So one of the things that we were trying to do a lot is just a typical strategy like think pair share or like things like that, where like you have a task to do, you get a minute to think on your own, and then you then work with a partner, share your partners in kind of like that smaller setting. You get to know your partner a little bit, and then after that we have our whole group. So you've had time to kind of digest and organize your thoughts a little bit, or like doing activities like removing the first lines from poems and then having cohort members like create their own first lines for the poem and things like that. And so I feel like that doing those sorts of activities where you're working in collaboration with another writer is difficult. Like I'm not going to deny, because usually when you write it's more solitary and you're kind of operating off your own ideas, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like this is now you're responsible, like it's a team. But at the same time, I think you're doing it over the course of 3 days with a variety of activities. You get to know a lot of your members a little bit better. So I hope our all our fellows felt like they got to know each other. We're also a smaller group. There were some people got sick partway through, but we're bouncing between like about 7 8 people in the room at one time. So it's not like a huge space, but it's enough that you get a variety of different thoughts and things like that, because I think that's important. Like I think you want to feel connected with the people you're with, but you also want to, at least in my mind, for the space I'm trying to organize, you want to feel like you're also really honing in on the craft element.
Yeah. I think one of the things I really appreciated, because I mean, I wasn't able to be at the retreat in full, but during the space that I was able to share with you guys, as you're leading that group, I think one of the things that maybe is missing from the poetry community, not necessarily in totality, but definitely there's absolutely a lot of poets that have never really experienced editing and craft in a formal setting, right? Yeah. So a lot of them, you might have poems that you either send to a friend of yours, and the only thing your friend says is, "This is one of your best poems yet," and then you never. There's not really a lot of conversation around it. It's entirely possible that even when you send over, the poem to your friend, because your friend doesn't have any necessarily scope to even critique the piece, it's like you're not going to get a lot of helpful information out of like their observation, right? Especially if there's something specific if there's a space that you've never been in before that you want to engage with this poem. It's like if you're sending it to your core group of friends that have also never really engaged with that space before, a lot of times the feedback, it might be good feedback to get from your friends, but it might ultimately not be incredibly useful feedback for what you want to do with the poem. And so I think being in this space with somebody like you, somebody who's really engaged with the publication process and also has like a myriad of experiences just with craft as well, having went to multiple retreats, and then just in general in education, I think you can really see, I think, some some spaces where it's a little bit difficult for people, because like that, and you have to have those spaces, right? Like every I know for myself personally, when I first started engaging with spaces where people were actively looking at my work, it's like, because for so many of us, by the time you're going to open mics or something like that, you probably represent the one person in your entire family that gets on a mic and does poems. Yeah. And you might also be one of the very few people that people would hear doing poems, and like maybe in class or just around, and people are like, "Oh, you're good. Oh, you're good." Right. So you've never really, until you've gotten to that space, you've never really went into a space where somebody said, yeah, this poem is not a poem, right? Or maybe not even that. Let me take that back. Where it's saying like this poem is not working for this reason or for this reason, or there's things that this poem is doing that you could be doing better, or you could be sharpening, or what have you. So I think that it was really cool to see people experiencing that for the first time. And the thing is, like the spaces that they were in right now, for some of the spaces that they might have been like, man, this is kind of frustrating, or what have you. I think you could also see the turn. Like we were talking about turns, but you could also see the turn where they were like, man, like my like we spent 15-20 minutes on this stanza, but afterwards the stanza not only looks different, but I'm much more confident in that portion of the poem. And it kind of gets you curious about what could the rest of my poems be if they went through this kind of process. And so yeah, it's a needed it's a needed process. And it's also, again, when we're talking about poetry community and we're talking about kind of just really approaching it from a space of wanting to be able to build community, I think that's like a incredibly healthy and beneficial foundation, that foundation of a poetry community that doesn't just rely on everybody getting together and being happy to be able to hear everybody's poem and be like, oh yeah, great, your poem was great, and then never really engaging with it again. Having something that's foundational, that's like, oh, like I can take these tools that I took from the Diversis retreat, like from this space where I had to look at my poem and I had to break down my poem. I had to answer questions. I had to answer questions that I didn't ask myself when I was writing the poem. You know what I mean? And then later on, I got to apply it to the poem, and now you have this little community of people, this cohort that can help you in that process. But then also that you're able to, like, now you have. And it was one of the other beautiful things that I like really noted when I was in the space is like these are all fairly like newer people to at least like the Columbus poetry community. You know what I mean? Like it seemed like they all had like some experiences, so it wasn't like, I'm not saying like they're new poets or anything like that, but some of them are, right? But for the most part, they were just like at the very least they're somewhat new to the Columbus poetry community. So it's also cool that later on down the line, they might have their group of friends, and their group of friends might have a poem, and somebody might have a poem like, oh cool, I really want to read this, what do you think about this, and then you can have some of those lessons be transposed into that space. So yeah, shout out to cohort 4. Good, you guys.
Yeah, let's go. I like that kind of the idea of even just like legacy building. Also, I want to speak to the workshop component for the feedback. Another thing that I wanted to do was our format is a little bit different. So the format of workshop we were using was like it's called like the courtroom, I think, where it's like everyone. So you read the poem, and then basically on a separate page, we use like Google Docs. So like everyone's just like kind of writing their ideas, like 2 points. It can be praise, it could be comments, it could be suggestions on a separate page that the poet who wrote the piece has access to. And then the poet then leads the discussion instead, the facilitator. So that way the poet has the choice of what direction they want the feedback of their poem to take. So like if there's a comment that they don't feel like addressing, or they're like, oh, maybe they completely misunderstand what the poem's about, or I don't feel like discussing this, or whatever, you don't have to discuss it because the poet brings it up. So I like the idea that the poet who's getting feedback is also the one in charge of getting the feedback in a way, or kind of like leading the discussion. And then when points are raised, then we also kind of go around and say, all the members get to say like whether they agree with the point or whether they disagree, because that can also inform how much of a consensus there is around a point of feedback. So then the poet can get a sense of, oh, only one person really thought this in this room, or it's like, oh, like 80% of people kind of thought this. Maybe there is something that I need to address here.
Yeah, I also think it because if you're bringing your poem to a group of people to be able to like work on and kind of excavate the poem and kind of pull it apart and really examine it. I think you have to come to terms with, you know, that there might be something wrong with your poem, right? And or not even necessarily wrong. There might be something that you can make clear in your poem, or your poem might not be what you think your poem is, right? And I think that's like a really hard thing for a lot of people to come to terms with, especially again. So again, by the time you're an open micer, by the time you're a regular poetry writer, you represent a very small community, you know what I mean, of like people, probably people in your normal group, unless everybody in your family's like poets or something like that. Like typically like most people don't even like public speaking. Most people aren't necessarily writing poetry every day or all the time or even intentionally. So the thought that you might have a lot of experience with somebody critiquing and kind of looking at your work in that way is not super high. So I just think like this idea that, you know, you're bringing your work in front of these people, and you know, you're accepting that there's going to be edits, there's going to be things that people kind of see, and then also putting it on you to kind of lead that and kind of address that. I almost wonder, like, what do you think? Do you feel like there's advantages to doing it in that process, as opposed to, I know like before, when we've engaged with like workshops, we essentially have the writer, they'll read the piece, they'll read the poem, and then everybody else will be able to have a discussion around the poem, and the writer can't really say anything. I know you talked about this a little bit, but I just kind of noticed some of the build up in that space, and I'd like love to hear kind of like maybe what, for instance, it should into.
Yeah. I mean, I think they both work. In general, I've been in both situations and they're fine. One of the things that can happen is that those situations where the poet's silent and people are just kind of commenting, is that the discussion can go on tangents very, very easily. A lot of times there's not like a set necessary like time period. And so we can end up having talks that lose focus and potentially, and at worst, just kind of waste time. Additionally, it can also be, potentially harmful to the poet if a poet has a set reader in mind and the cohort space that they're working with isn't that reader. There's a chance that there could be misunderstandings or misinterpretations of pieces. I mean, this is something that's been a big critique of that traditional workshop method is called like the Iowa model, where the poet sits silent and everyone talks about it. That's been a big kind of attack that's been levied against the Iowa model for some time, especially like, for instance, and obviously not the only case, but like poets of color, going to a space that's dominated by like white poets. Or you could have like a female poet entering a space that's like dominated by like male poets, with situations where you're dealing with cultural or demographic differences, and your poems are hitting on subject matter that the other group has less connection to, and so may misunderstand or completely not take the way that the writer intends. And so that sort of Iowa model can be potentially harmful or cause people to write in a certain way, because then you're also writing feedback. I mean, you write feedback. You what can also happen is you end up writing poems that you're like, oh, I know this will do well in my group. Right, especially if you're having like these feedback sessions are kind of less controlled in a way. Whereas I think I really like the workshop model that we use, because I think that, again, it puts the poet back in control, because the poet can also write things down too, because they can write down questions or comments that they want to kind of center around, and again, they can see the points and they can determine, is this a point I do want to raise, or is this a point I don't want to raise, and then you get again that sense of consensus. So I don't know if I have to choose one or the other. I really like the courtroom style a lot more.
Yeah, no, and I can appreciate it too, because I think that like and we probably, and you know, probably unbeknownst to me, we probably have ran into like spaces where somebody's been like, well, hold on, there's like a cultural nuance or, you know, familial nuance or something like that, that maybe it's being missed because the conversation is happening without my input or without me saying anything. I think there's something to that as well, because there, I mean, I think there's some value that can be derived from that, because it's like, you know, let's say if you're like, I want to send it to a publisher, you know, I want to submit this for like a competition or something of that nature. It's like when you send it into them, it's like that's also going to be a space which you don't know who's going to be reading it. You know what I mean? You don't know what cultural points are going to hit or anything like that. And so, I mean, I think there's some value there, but I also think that, like, you know, that's your risk to take at that time. Right. Whereas like in that workshop element, you know, naturally, if your goal on your end is to essentially invite as many like points of input, but while giving yourself the space to be able to regard the input, you know, to whatever value that you put put the input in that space, I think is really good. Yeah, it's so funny because I think like in real time you kind of see it, like as I'm like watching each person kind of guide the conversation like around their poem, you can kind of see the parts where people like are really attached, where they're like, you know, this is like a really important piece of my part of the poem, and but they're still bringing up the critiques around that part, which is really cool because essentially it does give them the space to defend. Right now they're, because you should be able to be defensive over your work, and I think that's like a really I don't want to say taboo, but it feels taboo. It feels like, you know, it feels like if you're in a workshop and then somebody is like, you know, you're being real defensive over your work, it's like, because you could be right. You know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of times we engage with criticisms and stuff like that around the work as if like whoever's critiquing it, if they're critiquing it in the course of a workshop, then they're right. And I'm like, man, no, there's a lot of times, man, that you can bring your poems to people and people sully the work because they're thinking, hey, no, I know better than this point or this point or what have you. So it's just to say like critique is like it's very very true that, hey, if somebody gives you this critique, like you can take it or leave it, but it's also like very very true, and I hope like poets kind of take this, and I again, one of the reasons why I like the method that you implemented this go around, like somebody can add a critique to your work that is would ultimately degrade your work, and you can actually spot it out, you can see it, and you can have the conversation around it, but I would say like don't feel that pressure to say, well, oh, man, they are the ones that are critiquing the work. You know what I mean? Like, you know, you wrote it down, so, you know, I would say like only like make those changes or what have you if you believe in them. So like in the same exact way that you wrote it down and so you believe in it, like only make those changes if you believe something differently now.
I like it too because it also makes everyone involved, because sometimes in a traditional, more Iowa model, like someone raise a point, but you don't know if other people necessarily agree with it or disagree with it so much. Whereas this is like you raise a point, you discuss the point, and then at the end of it, you cast a vote. You know, so you get to see, does everyone agree? Does half the room agree? Does only a quarter of the room agree? So like, I think that's really valuable too, because you get a greater sense of what the whole group's experience was with the piece, which I think is really valuable too. Because if you're like, oh, that person made a good point, but actually, everyone else disagrees, so maybe I won't do that, you know, or maybe I will do that. I don't know. One of the things I kind of wanted to focus on today for like our second half is just kind of like the four big takeaways, not just from like the workshop, but also from like the analysis sections that I think were kind of points that were very reoccurring throughout the retreat. It was great to see that during the retreat, things that we mentioned on the first day or on the second day would repeat themselves, and like our fellows would be saying it to themselves like during it. It's like constantly like repeating things, which I thought was great to see. Probably one of the biggest lessons we talked about was just talking about your reader, knowing who your reader was. I think for a lot of us when we entered the space, it was a question that we weren't necessarily considering, but we started really taking the time and being intentional. Like, all right, let's, like, if we had to like paint a portrait of our reader in like 3 sentences, you know, what do you know about them, you know? We compared it, for instance, talking about, like, for instance, like Rupi Kaur, you know, like, how is Rupi Kaur able to fill an auditorium of 2,000 people with poetry, you know? That's something that is really difficult to do, you know? It's not even guaranteed that, like, even like you take even like Hanif and things like that. Like, Hanif could probably do it, but even that's like on a like consistent level, you know what I mean? Like, it's like filling an auditorium with 2,000 people for poetry. And it's also tricky with Hanif too, because Hanif, yeah, he does poetry, but there's a lot of other types of writing going on too. You know what I mean? But like strictly like purely poetry, 2,000 people auditorium. Think about, you have to know your readers so well. You have to know what kind of work is really resonating with them, because you have to know that's how you reach them. You have to be able to create that sort of work. So that's something that we spent a lot of time talking about. Like, you know, if you're your own reader, that's cool, but you can't be upset if you read your poem and no one likes it. If you're your own reader and you're telling yourself that, you know.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard too, because I think that, like, again, we talked about when you're writing in solitude, right? So unless you have this really acute finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist, and you're like, I know what the people need, I know what the people want, or if you're like one of the people that are the movers of, like, you know, what people want or need, or like the influencers of that, then more than likely there is a subsection of people that is going to really relate to you, that either you're doing the work to get in front of, or you might miss altogether because you're trying to appeal to everybody, but your work, you like the everything around your work is trying to appeal to everybody except for your work. But you know what I mean? Like, your work is appealing to just this kind of subsection of people. So yeah, I think that that's a really interesting kind of point too, because I think that there's a lot of poets that I mean Hanif, I absolutely believe is one of them. If Hanif, you know, if there was an auditorium, 2,500 people, and he promoted it, I mean, he put it out. I mean, he could probably put it out last week, and then tomorrow the event's happening. Like, people would travel, people would do that just because, like, of the regard that his work has. So, and again, like, it's like that as well. It's like, you know, how naturally Hanif's talent and work ethic is clearly present in everything that he kind of engages with. But I'm like, how have you built up your either resume or your work or the conversation around your work, so that it can be packaged in a way that you can say, hey, I'm going to be here performing these poems, you should come, and then people come through.
Yeah. So that was a big takeaway that we got through right on day one. I'll say another big thing that we spent a decent amount of time talking about. I think a lot of people, especially poets who rhyme, which you see a lot, especially in performance spaces, it's interesting because I think one of the things we saw, because a decent number of our group was kind of more focused on like performance space, but trying to get deeper into the page. A lot of people have a hard time with meter, which is kind of ironic. Like, you see a lot of
rhyming poets,
rhyming poets, but they have a hard, like, just trying to organize, like, just like, okay, trochees, like da 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 da, or like iams, like da 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 da. Like, it was something that took a decent amount of effort, and I think we got better at it. You know, granted, it's a 3-day span, but
what do you think is the roadblock there, or like the pre like workshop or roadblock?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they're writing rhymes, I mean, you can literally see on their pages, if you ask to like see their poem, I think one of the things you'll see is that their line breaks. I think there's a real lack of understanding or lack of confidence or just lack of practice in understanding the difference between line and sentence, because a lot of people group their sentences like lines,
Yeah.
but lines, they're not the same. You can have lines that extend beyond. I mean, you can have sentences that go multiple lines. Like it just like goes across. So like concepts related to enjambment seem to be difficult, and I'll bring this back to meter in a moment. But I think this is another kind of factor with it. I think a lot of times poets are writing down things, thinking about how they will say it, and be like, okay, this is how I would say it, so it needs to look that way on the page. Where it's like, well, there doesn't necessarily have to be that
Yeah.
correlation.
And that it's yeah, because exactly, there's also like, because they're only thinking about how they're gonna read it, they're not like, maybe that is what helps them read it. So maybe you can make the argument that you have a different version for the one that you're reading on stage and the one that you have there on the page. But yeah, I think that, I mean, myself included, I don't think that when I first started writing poetry that I even had a second thought of what it looked like on the page. You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't even necessarily thinking of, how I was reading it. I'm like, this is how I wrote it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just, if a line felt like, if this just felt like a natural place to stop on the page, or I just thought, how I typically would see poems on the page, I would see 4 stanzas. I mean, 4 lines, stanza, 4 lines, stanza, 4 lines, stanza, 4 lines, stanza, and just do that forever. And so there wasn't a lot of thought as far as, how to construct it, which is also, I think, something that I thought was really cool. Just like being in real time and watching somebody looking at their poem and thinking like, well, I didn't really have a reason for the poem to look like this. I had the method, I knew what I was doing, but I didn't have a reason for it. And then once you add that into the equation, once you start saying, well, hey, there's something that you could do that would be a creative way to approach how this poem is being paged, it opens up a whole other dimension.
It does. No, it really does. And I think it gives you just such a greater understanding. Like, a lot of, for instance, when discussing meter, a lot of people are really focused on syllables, which is a key factor, but it's like, you're like, oh, so meter, then I always need to have 10 syllables. It's like, well, it doesn't always work out that way. The meter, there's a lot of flexibility with meter. It's not exactly the same thing. And I think learning about meter teaches us also how, kind of related to our third point, maybe. Maybe it could be our third point. Like, really starting to question how every decision I make in my poem is in service to the poem.
Yeah.
Every line break, rhyme, breaking away from rhyme. So, for instance, one of the prompts was they wrote a haiku, and then they had to transform that haiku into a sonnet. It was a trochaic tetrameter. So basically, they needed trochees. They needed 4 trochees per line. Okay, so like da 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 da. That's the rhythm that they needed. And one of the things we discussed, looking at even Shakespeare sonnets, was that even if you look at Shakespeare sonnets, it's not like meter is 100% accurate. Like, even Shakespeare, you look at some of his lines, and it's not like, oh, he may have used trochees for most of it, but there's not going to be trochees for all of it. Or he may have been iambic for most of it, but it wasn't iambic for all of it. And so, I forget the topic of the poem, but one of our fellows, they wrote a poem, this trochaic tetrameter poem, but they had one line that wasn't trochaic. It started with an I am. And it started with the line started like especially rare or something like that. And we're like, well, maybe that actually serves the poem, because everything else is trochaic, but you have a line that starts off with like especially rare. So you have one line in your poem that's not doing what the other lines are. So it's kind of reinforcing that sense of being rare and special. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like it's like just that's just like one example, but like what are other things that you can do in your poem that can reinforce what your poem's about? Or another student, they had like they started a line with the word like abruptly. They were writing trochees, but a line started with abruptly, and we talked about kind of like the irony of that, right? Like you have trochees, but then you have this word irony, which means like suddenly, like abruptly, which means suddenly, but abruptly actually is iambic, so it's not actually abrupt, right? Because it takes a second to get to the stress. So it's like just talking about like little ironies like that and like little tensions and things that you can add to your pieces. Those are just examples through meter, but you know it goes on to like adjectives. You know it goes on to the verbs you're using, the word choices. Everything serves the poem.
Yeah, I think about like the difference between. Well, hold on. Permission to use an analogy.
Granted, tentatively.
Okay, so like the difference between like just a regular candy store and like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, right? So like in a regular candy store, you might walk in, the candy's in the dishes over there, and it's on the walls and all this other stuff, and that's cool. But in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, it's like everything is made out of candy, right? So like the doors are candy, the river that's going through, it might be water. No, that's chocolate. There's like everything that is constructed around you is not just to be like, I want to sell you candy. It's to put you inside of this world of candy, right? Or like candy and chocolate and stuff like that. And I think that's like a really I think it's a really good point to kind of transfer over to your work, because I think a lot of times we're only thinking of the words translating what we want to be saying, right? And it is the words that are translating what you want to be saying, but it's not just what you're reading. It's how you're reading it. It's what it's looking like on the page. It's like, you know, where a line might stop. That's going to give you, you know, you can be any, like, I can't remember whose poem it was, but there's like somebody's poem. And I remember reading the poem. And as I was reading the poem, there was a stoppage in the poem where I'd be like, that's where I'd want the poem to stop. And then, but it was also like the writer, or the writer, she was trying to convey a bit of an uneasiness as well in the poem, but I'm like, because she ended it with trying to comfort the audience in the two stanzas afterwards, because she's like trying to dull the blow of the thing that happened 2 stanzas ago. It's like, yeah, you're trying to convey like an uneasiness, but in your communication of that, it's like you had already done it. You were already there. Now, like, don't just convey it by telling me now, because now the more that you're telling me, the more that you're taking away from the uneasiness that I already felt. Leave it there, so now it's not just what I read, but it's also the shock of the fact that there's no more poem now. Like, now I'm just here with this feeling. So, yeah, there's a lot of other ways that you can communicate what your poem is doing, and how you're communicating it is gonna, you know, that's going to be the best marker of like what people are walking away with from your poem.
Yeah, and I think kind of building on that point as well, we talked, that's probably my 4th point, is just like the most important parts of poems. And this is especially true it's true if you're trying to get published. This is true if you're performing a poem on stage. This goes beyond poetry. I mean, it's, you know, the more I study other things, like my main business is like teaching. You know, I look at a lot of videos on like entrepreneurship, but like the big thing is that, you know, everything I learn, I feel like I see in other arenas. You know, like everything's connected. And from a poetry's perspective, the most important parts of your poem are your title, your first line, your last line. You know, how are you starting the conversation, how are you ending the conversation? You know, those are going to be the first areas that are going to jump out to your reader's mind. You know, from an editor's perspective, like if you have a poem that has a great, you know, middle, but if no one's going to read there because the intro is bad, you know, an editor can't use that poem because they're like, look, no one's going to get there. Yeah. You know, you have to be able to get someone there. The first line is also so important because that's the line that it determines what your reader's going to expect. You know, it's like we're establishing, you know, the suspension of disbelief that we need. We're establishing the grounding that we're going to get used to. So like, if I step onto this boat and I'm like, I don't know if this boat's going to hold my weight or not, I'm probably not going to step in that boat. You know, it's the same thing with your poem. And I think this carries over to performance. You know, the very first thing you say is super, super important. You know, but this also carries over to your conversation. Like if you meet someone, you know, your very first interaction with someone can, to a degree, dictate how the rest of that relationship goes. You know, it determines like how people are going to perceive you and if they want to, how they want to navigate, you know, interacting with you in the future. You know, we really, there are no words to waste at any moment. Like every word is really, really important. So we have to understand the value of that. And so when you're writing poems, we spent a lot of time in the workshop dedicated to, you know, creating first lines, discussing first lines, moving things around to see could we find a first line that's more impactful maybe later on in the poem and kind of switch it, because you have to start with something that's going to engage your reader.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of bringing it back to the performance aspect, because I think one of the things that you also see a lot of is people writing shock value titles, right? Mm-hmm. So like they'll write up, or they'll write the rest of the poem for the shock value to support the shock value of the title, and so like doing that and being like genuine with the work is like a really tough kind of line to straddle. Mm-hmm. But I also think that just thinking back to how poems are performed and the reasons why it's really important for like again, how your poem is being performed should also be informed by what the poem is, because a lot of times you see people they'll only know how to perform one way, right? They'll have watched enough Button Poetry, Voices in Power, there's no issues with these platforms or issues with, you know, naturally the poems on the platform, which is just outside of just the fact that, you know, if you are a writer who is quote maybe like impressionable, or just somebody who's like, man, like I've spent hours and hours listening to these people do poems, and maybe now you think that the way to do poems is only this, so maybe you're writing this really soft, like I don't know, like maybe you're writing a poem about like a mouse running through a corridor, and like maybe that's like it should feel confined, right? Maybe you should feel small and confined. Mm-hmm. Like maybe going into that poem with the booming voice, like maybe that's not like, you know, the best approach to that poem, because you're putting me in the mind space and the head space of this really small confined piece, but you're giving me the sound and the vibrance of something that's a lot larger. And so I think that's like and again, even with that, so like if you're writing a poem about a mouse going through a corridor, what about the size of your font? Is that going to be large? Is it, or do you consider maybe shrinking the font, maybe putting it in like kind of orienting it on a page in a specific way? Mm-hmm. So it's just, there's a lot of things that you can really consider that can really make the experience of the poem different.
Yeah. Like I have a poem talking about my grandmother. She passed, and she had a lot of like artifacts from like Egypt and things like that. So I wanted the poem to also kind of resemble like hieroglyphs, but using letters. So how do you do that? So it ended up just like visually really spacing out the letters a lot, which is a gamble because it makes the poem harder to read, because you look at it visually and it can be a little overwhelming because everything's really spaced out. But, you know, it was a risk. It's interesting because when I didn't do that, it made it easier to read and made it more traditional. It had a hard time getting published, but the second I did that like spacing and like, you know what, it's harder to read now, and I'm just gonna have to trust that the right reader is gonna be willing to work with it, and the reader that's not is not the audience I'm looking for. You know what I mean? As soon as I did that, it got published like pretty fast. You know, so I think we have to be comfortable with taking the risk that the poem needs. This goes back to that third point we talked about. You know, everything serves the poem.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I feel like we really have to go back. Where are these artifacts from Egypt? Because
It's like it's not like any. It's like a bookmark.
Guess what,
It's
Jess?
like
We
it's
just
like that.
we're starting the movie today. Brendan Fraser, contact us.
Like
We want to be in the
crawling
Mummy
under our
4.
skin. Yeah,
We
no,
need to.
it's
we need to
nothing.
get
No,
this-
it's
this
oh, do I? Is it? Do I? So like for instance, that little you can see it. I don't know if you see that like chariot thing over there.
That's from Egypt?
That's from Egypt. Yeah.
We just
hang on 1 second.
Hey everybody, this is just now stop becoming diverse is the poetry podcast.
I don't know how authentic this is. This could
Everybody.
have just been like some guy just like making these in his basement to like sell, but
This is from
it's
Egypt.
from Egypt. Yeah.
All right, everybody. So the next
from Egypt.
podcast that we do, we're gonna be doing it from Egypt. We're gonna be
It's not. I tried to buy my aunt for 40 camels. It's like,
maybe this picture will do.
yeah,
Well.
so it was like that. There was like a vial of sand.
A vial of sand.
Yeah, from Egypt. Yeah.
Where's the vial of sand?
I'd have to find it.
Jeff, we can have
You're like
superpowers
really
right now,
good.
man.
It's like
You should have. Did you at least try to hold the vial? You got to hold the vial.
She gave us. She gave all.
You
of
have
us
to hold
ones,
the
so-
vial of sand. Were you at least holding it during the eclipse?
I was not. No, was I supposed to charge it?
Oh my gosh,
I
we're
did
just
it
missing
wrong.
these opportunities.
It's like,
You have a vial of sand from Egypt, and you didn't even hold it during the eclipse.
Didn't
Like
even
this is
think
how
to.
these movies start.
Didn't
Okay.
even think to.
Well, next eclipse in 2045. Wait, is that the next one in 2045?
Is that through Ohio or is it just in the U.S.?
I don't know.
If you guys know eclipse things,
If you guys know,
let us know.
the next eclipse, because we just have to be prepared this time. Sorry guys, I was not informed that Jeff had a vial of sand. Wait, what else is it? A vial of sand? Have a picture. What else?
There was a bookmark that tries to tell you translate like the symbols into the alphabet.
Does it
Again, I
say
don't know
you
how
are
to-
the chosen one?
It does not say that.
You don't even know.
It says you are not the chosen.
Oh man, there's so many adventures we could have been on just now.
Yeah, it wasn't me. This was my grandmother.
And that's how the movie starts, because it's like your grandmother's like, "Hey, Jeff, you're the chosen one, but don't say anything. Just take these artifacts and then put them together during the eclipse, so you can accept your powers."
Well, God bless her zombie bones.
God bless her zombie bones.
Yes.
And how did she become a zombie? Because she has the artifacts.
I shouldn't have used the word artifacts. I should have just said
Oh, it's too
stuff.
late.
I should have said stuff from Egypt.
I would have made the connection regardless. I would have made the leap
not.
to artifact soon enough.
All right.
after that.
Anyways, this is the point in the show where the podcast evolves. Yeah. Things I don't remember the exact order we had, but the four things were, where did we start? Okay. Well, we can work backwards. So the fourth thing again was just making sure to. Actually, I guess it was third. The third thing was like to make sure everything is serving the poem in terms of like your line breaks, your structure, and things like that. I forget the first one was like meter. Like I think meter is a device, even if you're not a rhyming poet, even if you're not interested. I think just having a greater sense of just like the acoustics and how the sounds of a poem work and how the structure of a poem works, and because it really does give you a greater sense of rhythm.
Yeah.
And I think it helps you pay attention also to things like consonants and assonance and rhyme and internal rhyme and stuff like that. We also said, make sure you're paying attention to like the key points in your poem, your first line, your last line, and your title. You could even add into that, including a turn. We were talking again about sonnets. So sonnets, traditionally, a lot of people weren't even entirely sure about sonnet. They're like 14 lines. I'm like, yeah, but there's a lot more than that. In terms of structure. So like the interesting thing about a sonnet, right, is that it's not balanced. It's intentionally not balanced. It's not 7 and 7. It's 8 and 6. So you have 8 stanzas that are doing one thing, and then you have 6. You have 8 lines that are doing one thing across 2 quatrains.
8 stanzas.
Yeah, right.
Oh my gosh.
And then you have your final like 6 lines, which are typically subverting your initial 8. So like that sense of balance, or lack of balance, in addition to like your turn. And then I feel like there's one thing I'm missing that we talked about at the beginning, but I don't remember what it was. But it was there. You can look
Some
for
of
it.
our workshopping poems, but the type of workshopping that we were doing.
I mean, we talked about the workshopping strategy. So again, I would encourage you, if you are interested in taking a retreat, find out what the workshop style is, and see. You could even like propose it to your teacher about different styles as well. So again, one style that we used again was called the courtroom. Otherwise, most likely the style that you'll be using is called the Iowa model.
Can you go to just like a treat, and then the next one you go to be the retreat? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have. Well, this one might work.
That's fair. That's
very, very fair.
I respect that. I have to respect that decision.
Right. Anyways, Matthias, any final thoughts about anything that we discussed from today?
Not really, man. I'm really excited for, I think, everybody that kind of came out of that space, man. And again, as somebody who like you've worked on my poems before, but it was like in like a less formal setting than like kind of that space. It was really cool to be able to see, I think, everybody's kind of like the impact on everybody, because it's also like you can see the wheels turning. You can see people kind of understanding themselves and understanding like the direction of the writing, which is kind of like that's the real point, right? So the retreat isn't just so that you can have a poem edited. It's so that maybe next time you're writing a poem, you're asking yourself some of the questions that that you didn't know to ask yourself before.
Yeah, it's not really about the poems that you write then, it's about the poems that you write afterwards. I would agree with that.
For sure.
All right. We released you. Let us know if you've attended a retreat, what your own thoughts are, things you've liked, things that you wish were different. We would love to know about your own insights. Thanks again to all our members from the Diversus Spring Poetry Retreat 2024.
Yeah.
Something we're trying to do where we would like it to be a quarterly type thing. So keeping your eyes peeled for when our next retreat dates would be. Probably sometime in the summer, maybe end of summer. So just kind of keeping an eye out for that. Once more, my name is Jeff.
My name is Matthias. But don't we got some stuff coming up?
We do have some things. So if you're in Columbus, a couple things are upcoming.
If you're a Columbi,
Thursday we are doing our author photo. So come and get a free author photo from us.
Where's that going to be?
Most likely it's going to be at Roosevelt, because some places get nervous when you bring cameras around. Not to name names. So we're going to be at Roosevelt Coffee at 462 West Broad. Friday we have our open mic at Thurway Cafe on the west side.
Oh yeah.
Sunday for Columbus Poets. We had to retreat this weekend, so we couldn't do it. So this upcoming weekend we'll be doing Pep and Poets. So if you want to meet and get some free pizza and talk poetry and craft and goals and successes and publishing and anything poetry related, you can meet with us on Sunday, limited to 6 seats. So claim a seat for that. A couple other things that are upcoming as well. We have a couple workshops coming up in April. I believe it's the 20th and 27th. It's the Saturday, whenever around the 20th is, whatever that Saturday is. We're going to be at the Southeast Branch leading a workshop on how to create first lines and entries into poems. And then the week after that, we'll have an open mic. Also, there's so much happening. On May 11th, for people in Columbus, we're going to be doing our morning mic. So that's a Saturday.
Wait, you got to...
Yep. And that's going to be...
I didn't...
That's breaking news. That's fine. So we're going to be doing a morning mic. So if you would like to go to open mics, but you're like, man, 7:30, 8, 9 p.m., if you're the Nest, 1 a.m.
Oh my god.
Have fun.
It's legit at 9:30. Guys, it's legit at 9.
It legit starts at 9.
We weren't even the last one ended at like 11.
Okay.
11:20.
Yeah, well,
that's not late at all.
Okay. Sometimes they creep. Anyways, if you're like, man, that sounds late. Well, we're going to be trying. This is our first ever morning mic. We're excited to partner with Third Way Coffee on that. And we're going to be also hosting in May a poetry networking event. We'll have more information about that soon. But if you want to meet poets and talk about poets without just doing like an open mic, this will be your opportunity. I think that's everything.
I think that is
This
everything.
calendar is very full. All right. We will see you all later, guys. Have a good day. Have a good night. Have a good afternoon. Thanks for stopping by. We'll see you next time.